So you can see here, the front wall of the dwelling is only 6.5 meters. So you automatically trigger reporting consent because you're not stepped back 7.6 meters. And then also you've got a porch approaching into the front street setback with a height of greater than 3.6. So that would also be your trigger for reporting consent. Regulation 75. So, more common for your double-story dwellings. You can't exceed 9 meters unless the land slopes at 2.5 degrees at 8 meter cross section. So you can go above 9 meters to 10 meters, provided that the land slopes at 2.5 degrees. And the building height at 1 meter setback, which is for your garages mainly, at 1 meter from the boundary. So this is your boundary line here, and then 1 meter in from there, you can't exceed 3.6, and that includes parapets and your pitch roofs. 76 is just side coverage. So basically all of the building, the garage, porch, veranda, and the house. So typically it's 60%. And then obviously you get your MCPs covenants, which may vary. That's 50%, sometimes even 40. So can't exceed 60% of allotment. So it's basically just for this scenario here, it would be 408 times 0.6, and that'll give you your max floor area, basically building footprint. Permeability, so 20% of the allotment, and obviously subject to MCPs and covenants and things like that. So typically it's 20% in the regulations, and that basically means anything permeable. So you must have 20% of the land permeable. So that's your grass, decking, vegetable gardens are permeable, and then basically all of these things here are impermeable, so you can't include that in your 20% calculation. Car parking, so pretty. You need at least 2 car parking spaces on each allotment, and it only applies for brand new dwellings. So if you're doing an existing house, you don't need to worry about this regulation. But if the car parking spaces adjoin each other in a garage, then your minimum dimensions are 6 meters and 5.5. And it's important to note that it's an internal dimension. So you can see the measurements here are taken from the piers and not from the outer edges, just to allow for those car parking spaces. And when you have a single car garage and a second space, your minimum dimensions are 6.5 by 3.5 internal dimension, and then your second space at the front is 2.6 to 4.9. So generally I think it's your smaller housing codes with your single car garages, which will probably have this. I think it's the same in smaller housing code for this requirement. And when we take this measurement, the measurement's usually taken to the garage door, just so there is sufficient space there. 79, probably similar to 74. There's a lot of reporting consents, and this relates to your wall heights. And so basically anything set back not within 200 mil of the boundary needs to be set back at 1 meter, and your maximum height at 1 meter is 3.6. And then you can see the diagram here. So 6.9 is your 2 meters. And there are allowable encroachments, which is your eaves, fascias, your gutters, 600 mil in total width, area of not more than 2 meters squared, and less than 1 meter high, unroofed stairways and ramps, pergolas, shade sails, and carports. This regulation, when you have north facing windows, basically just ignore this one because the north facing windows are a lot more strict. And there is a calculation. I'm not too sure if you guys know the formula of working on wall heights or setbacks, but we can give that to you after the slideshow if you don't want. You can see here, this is an example. I think this is one of your guys' jobs. So you put the res code line, so 3.6 at 1 meter, and then it increases in increments of 0.3 to 6.9. And basically, you can see that your eaves, fascias, and gutters are approaching, but they are permissible under regulation 79. Walls on bound. Bound. I'll try and talk a bit louder. So regulation 80, walls on boundaries, so 0 to 200. If you're 201 millimeters, you need reporting consent because you don't fall between 200 and a meter. So as soon as you fall between 200 and a meter, you need a reporting consent. So walls on boundaries is two things: your average height and your maximum wall height. So this here, you can have an average of 3.2 and 3.6, which you clearly comply with. And usually when you comply with regulation 75, it's not going to comply with this regulation. So the calculating the average wall height as well is not just taking your maximum and minimum wall height and dividing that by 2. You need to take the area of the wall and divide that by 2. I'm going to hand over to John for the more interesting regulations.
Thank you, Mark. So Reg 81, we've got daylight to existing habitable room windows. So basically, our proposed walls or the proposed walls you're building need to ensure that they maintain light for any existing neighbours next door. So basically, the regulations or the criteria you need to meet is next door's adjoining windows need to face a light port of 3 square metres with a minimum dimension of 1 metre. So that can include land on the adjoining allotment. So if they're set back 500 mil or a metre, we can safely say that they're facing a light port of 3 square metres. You can go 3 metres from the window with a metre dimension to that total boundary. However, if you do have a wall that is opposite the existing window that has an average height of more than 3 metres, you need to be set back half the height of the average height of that wall. So, for argument's sake, let's say we've got a wall height with an average height of 4 metres. You need to ensure that you are set back 2 metres from any existing windows. And so that dimension can include land on the adjoining allotment. So we've got a couple of diagrams here that can show how you can achieve compliance. So it's only essentially the setback portion of that wall is only for the portion of which it affects the adjoining windows. So you can see that how they've had to notch out the proposed wall to achieve a light port for the existing window. And it's only for the portion of the wall that doesn't comply. So for whatever setback you need to ensure it's just that portion of the wall you need to comply with. And here as well, we've got a diagram that shows we've got eave linings here. So existing dwelling and then our proposed dwelling on the left. You can see the eave linings here. And then we can see we can achieve the 1 metre clear to the sky dimension using land on both of the allotments. So yeah, that's Reg 81. Reg 82 is probably one of our most fun regulations that we spend a lot of time dealing with in office. It's essentially allowing light to get to adjoining facing habitable room windows. So there's a couple of criteria that we need to ensure that it meets in order to know definitely that your windows next door are north facing. So we need to make sure, first thing we check is that the windows are orientated true north. which is in between a bracket here, you can see 30 degrees east to 20 degrees west. Anything within that bracket is a north-facing window. It's a habitable room window. It's within 3 metres of the tidal boundary. If you've got a north-facing window that's within that area or that bracket, if it's step back 3.5 metres, you don't need to comply with north-facing windows because it's already compliant. So if it's 2.5 metres or step back 1 metre from the tidal boundary, then that's another key criteria we have a look into. And also on your titles, you'll see how you've got the degrees and minutes of your tidal boundaries. We've been able to work out that any window facing a boundary that is within 70 degrees to 120 degrees and 250 to 300 is within that 20 degrees west and 30 degrees east. So that's our key criteria we look at to determine if it is, yes, a north-facing window that we need to comply with. If it doesn't meet one of those, it's not a north-facing window we need to comply with. So that's your key criteria to determine whether or not you need to ensure compliance with a north-facing window. So the requirements of your proposed dwelling. So a greater height / setback ratio, which I'll get into in just a moment on the next slide. It applies to the applicable part of the window that's within 3 metres. So as you can see here, they're only taking into account the portion of the window that's within 3 metres of the tidal boundary. So if you have a graded window, as in this scenario here, so essentially you need 1 metre setback from the tidal boundary if you have a north-facing window. So if you have the adjoining allotment who's set back not as squared off to the tidal boundaries, as soon as you get to a distance of greater than 3 metres, you can put your wall on down. And then you've got to comply with regulating things of that nature. But as you can see here, it only applies to the window, the part of the window that's within 3 metres of the tidal boundary. Walls on boundary are not permitted, or the portion opposite the window that's within 3 metres. Even encroachments are not permitted. And of course, it only applies to windows that are oriented towards the boundary. If you've got a window that's facing a rear, it's obviously not north facing, so there's no need to take that into account. So this is just a comparison I thought I'd throw in just to show you the comparison between Reg 79 side and rear setbacks and Reg 82. So you can see here that you've got 6.9 metres at 2 metre setback for Reg 79. However, when we start factoring into north-facing windows, it automatically goes 6.9 is at 3 metres. So the ratio between 1 metre from 3.6 to 6.9 is much more stringent with Reg 82 because we've got to ensure that natural light is getting to those north-facing windows, which is why they've implemented a much stricter ratio going to 6.9 metres. Instead of just 6.9 at 2 metres, now it's 6.9 at 3 metres. So essentially, Reg 83 now, overshadowing. What you need to worry about. This is one that's obviously starting to creep in now. Blocks are getting tighter. Houses are starting to become existing now. There's a lot more people out there. So the OP is being issued left and right. So when we have to take into account overshadowing, it's essentially are your adjoining allotments existing and will the shadow created by the proposed building reduce any unshaded recreational private open space? Those are the two things you've got to have a look at. What we need when you provide your assessment, so we need the total recreational private open space for your adjoining allotments, not the proposed allotment. So what we're worried about with Reg 83 is reducing the unshaded recreational private open space to your adjoining neighbour, not you. Unshaded recreational private open space, so we need to know how much unshaded recreational private open space is provided to the adjoining allotments. This includes things like your existing fences, existing structures, anything of that nature, anything that's going to pass the shadow, we need it to be shown on the drawings. And basically the calculation that we have to ensure that complies is it's the lesser of the two, 40 square metres with a minimum dimension of 3, or 75% of the adjoining total recreational private open space, whichever is the lesser. So let's say for argument's sake, you can't achieve, next door don't have 40 square metres of recreational private open space, so you take into account their recreational private open space total, and you times that by 0.75. If that's under 40 square metres, then that's the dimension you're working on. So if you're under 40 square metres and you don't achieve 75% of the total recreational private open space, unshaded, you can't further reduce. So if you, let's say for argument's sake, you go out there and you calculate 75% of the total recreational private open space is 35 square metres, but they've only got 25 square metres of unshaded recreational private open space, can't further reduce. That automatically triggers a dispensation council. So that's where I think we're starting to get a bit stuck at the moment. We're seeing a lot of dispensations and a lot of queries going back and forth, not just with you guys, with all our builders, where we're further reducing, or if we're lesser than 75 square metres, we can't further reduce. So automatically, that's going to be a dispensation again. And another key thing to note is you have to determine compliance. We have to demonstrate compliance between 9 AM and 3 PM for 5 hours. But 5 hours don't have to be consecutive. So there can be an hour in there. Let's say 9 AM and 10 AM comply, but 11 AM doesn't. That's okay. It doesn't have to be consecutive. You just need to determine compliance for 5 hours. So this was one that popped up the other day, actually, that we had. So you can see that 75% of the total recreational private open space is 36.5 square metres, which is less than 40 square metres. So that's essentially the lowest we can go without triggering dispensation. But the total unshaded private open space we've got is 14 square metres for 10 AM and 7.2 square metres for 9 AM. So automatically, because we don't achieve the minimum recreational private open space of 36.5, automatically you've triggered a dispensation. So that's the key thing you're looking for there. If you're not achieving the minimum required recreational private open space, you can't further overshadow. So as soon as you start seeing little slivers of shadows, it's not going to be good. Maybe see if you can work your magic or anything like that, but you cannot further reduce. Okay, so overlooking is it's fairly straightforward. We've got 2 factors we're looking for here. We've got overlooking into existing habitable room windows, and we've got overlooking into private open spaces. 2 different diagrams that we go off. This diagram here is overlooking into the existing habitable room windows. So you can see here it's quite boxy. It's an overlooking controlled area. So for 9 metres, basically from a habitable room window of your proposed lot, 1.7 from the finished floor level, any adjoining habitable room window within this area needs to be protected from overlooking. So that's essentially your protected area. Overlooking into private open space, however, does have a different diagram. It's essentially looking down into private open space, which is where we can get a bit creative, and we can start using fence heights, we can start using whatever the case may be. But it is basically, if you have a direct line of sight into the adjoining neighbour's private open space, from the habitable room, you can see there, you need to protect that window from overlooking. So essentially, if we had a fence, let's say, on the boundary that was here, that was intercepting this sight line, that we deem as compliant. There's no direct overlooking, there's no direct line of sight. So that's okay. If we had anything intercepting that sight line, we deem compliant. But if you can see here, that's the boundary fence there. So obviously the ground floor habitable room is protected, but the first floor, there's no chance that's going to comply. So you do need to protect that window from overlooking. They like to existing habitable room windows. So we take a bit of a different stance on this than a few other building surveys. So essentially what you do need to achieve is your windows do need to place a light port of 3 square metres. There are certain examples of where they do determine compliance. If you've got a veranda, it must be open. If the window faces a veranda, it must be open for at least 1/3 of its perimeter, as you can see there. Excuse me. A carport must be open for at least 1/3 of its perimeter also. And must have 2 or more sides open, as you can see there. Now, a few of your designs do have habitable room windows facing an alfresco that is essentially notched into the dwelling itself. It technically doesn't comply with the regulation, but we do accept it because it is the design your owners have chosen. It doesn't affect, basically the only time we will knock it back is if you're affecting your adjoining neighbour. If your adjoining neighbour can't achieve a light port because you've got a veranda or a carport or anything like that close to the boundary, and they won't be able to put a window, or they won't be able to put a wall in boundary, they won't be able to do something like that, that's when we'll knock it back because it's inconveniencing next door, or we'll ask for a dispensation. But in the cases where you've got your dining doors going into your alfresco area, that's not facing an achievable light port, we will accept that because that's obviously a low risk of coming back because your neighbours have chosen that. Your owners have chosen that. So daylight to existing, this is just basically a diagram of another thing we are seeing as well with small lots, things of that nature. It's when you have a double story and you've got eaves on your first floor, you need to ensure that from your gutter to your tidal boundary, if you have habitable room windows that are facing an eave, you need to have a minimum 1 metre clear to the sky from gutter to tidal boundary. This dimension cannot include land on the adjoining allotment. It is purely on your allotment. So when you've got eaves on the first floor and you've got a really tight setback, you need to make sure that from your gutter to your tidal boundary, you're achieving a minimum 1 metre setback. Regulation 85 as well, private open space. The class 1 building on the allotment must have private open space of not less than 80 square metres or 20% of the allotment area, whichever is the lesser. It must include an area at the side or the rear of the dwelling, at least at 25 square metres, minimum dimension of 3. Now, what we tend to do with the type blocks as well, it can include the alfresco area. So if you, let's say you've got a 2.9 setback to the rear, to achieve your 25 square metres with a minimum dimension of 3, that can, as you can see there, that can include your alfresco. So as long as you achieve your 25 square metres with a minimum dimension of 3 in this portion here, we can start factoring in all other areas to the side or rear of the dwelling to make sure you achieve your 80 square metres or 20% of the allotment area. But you need to make sure that's your key criteria. That 25 square metres with a minimum dimension of 3 is what you need to achieve, and then we can start picking bits and pieces from everywhere else to make sure that you achieve your 20% or your 80 square metres. Yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. Nice and easy. I mean, there's a lot of things that are now coming up and a lot of different designs, and you guys are pushing the boundaries a little bit. It's good to see, and a lot of the questions coming through are testing our knowledge as well. So it's good to see. It's also good for the industry as well. I feel it's making things less stagnant, but it's also making your guys' jobs a lot harder, trying to fit houses on blocks that are trying to comply. So that's where the key relationship is with us and with you guys, working together to come to a solution. So yeah, we're more than happy to take any questions you guys have. We're happy to come up and we can go through the regs, and if you've got any designs you want us to have a look at before we leave, we're more than happy to have a look.
I've got a few. I've written it down.
Yeah.
They are regulated.
Yes.
And how do you guys sense gas needs?
So that's not for us to determine. It's purely a plumbing regs issue. Whether you've got bollards or you don't have bollards surrounding a gas meter, we're not looking at that. Yeah. So that's not for us to take into account. Yeah, that's not on our checklist. It's not a part of our building code. It's something that's got to be taken into account with the plumbing code, which is volume 3.
Yeah.
So yeah, from a permit point of view, nothing to look at.
That last box.
So battle axe blocks are actually in the regs now. They factor that in. We take it to the shared boundary so the rear boundary of the front lot. So basically, it's hard to explain.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we don't factor in the driveway at all. The front setback is taken from that shared boundary between the two lots.
And still over 800 mil. But
Yeah.
It's not more.
So we'll take that it's from the top of the fill, but it's 800 mil from the boundary line. So as soon as you get 800, so as soon as your fill could have a really weird fill block, as soon as your fill will draw a line straight to the top boundary. If that dimension at the top boundary is greater than 800, that's when we'll factor it in. So if it's less than 800 at the top boundary, we can factor it in from.
Do you have any tolerance for track fill over it?
Cut, yes. Fill, no. Cut, if you're cutting over the top boundary, we won't ask for fill over. It's only when you're filling over the edge. Is what we'll ask. Any amount of fill.
Sorry, what was that last one about? Cutting the easement?
Yeah, so cuts, we don't factor in build over. It's only when you're filling, or you've got eaves covering an easement, we don't factor that in. So we'll only ask for a build over easement consent when you're filling, or you've got eaves over the top over the easement.
If you're cutting like 500 million easement, you're going to compass back for a within the easement, you're not going to compass back.
We shouldn't pay none. Yeah. Yes.
You can consider any regulation flags if the neighbouring lots are frame stage, so you can see those coming up in that area, like stuff on the sea. Would you consider flagging it or jumping?
No. So what we do when joining allotments at frame stage is if you guys are nominated at frame stage and at a certain date, and we can determine that they're not going to have an occupancy permit before we issue a building permit, then it's fine. But if it's a bit touch and go, then we'll call it out ourselves, make sure they get no OP issue. And then, yeah, if they don't have an occupancy permit issue, we don't need to worry about their having windows or any other sliding matters for, yeah.
In regards to looking at those as a proportion, should we start looking at those in anyway, or?
I would love to, but I don't have to enforce you to. It's just to avoid, obviously, if they're going to give you occupancy permit before you guys, and then they're going to see, wow, they got these big double-story windows, unfortunately, because we issued our building permit before they received their OP, we complied at the time the building permit was issued. But yeah, we get a lot of calls about that because they said, well, we're living here now, they're going to be living there, they're going to be overlooking us, and it's a hard thing to explain the building regulations to somebody who doesn't know much about building. All they can see is that there's massive open issue, but it's something that we don't have to enforce.
Only time we'll enforce it, sorry, just to add on, is if your MCP requires it. If, regardless of the status of next door, if your MCP has an overlooking protection area, you have to comply with that. Whereas if you're just going straight res code, if there's no OP next door, there's no house next door.
Yeah, but that's typically a 3.5 overlooking zone. So as soon as you're within 3.5 meters of the tidal boundary for those MCPs, you need to screw those windows.
I'm trying to understand. There's no. If there's previously nominated as frame stage 2 meters off that boundary, we just nominate a magistrate and then instead of showing the building on. So
You can, because technically it is vacant. If it it's a bit of a tricky situation in the fact that obviously there's no structures on boundary, no footing probes or anything anywhere we need it. But if it does come back to us that for whatever reason they had their OP the day before we issued our permit, then we're going to have to enforce a notice, things of that nature, to make you obscure windows that need to be obscured, things of that nature. So it's better to give us all the information up front, just in case, because then we can do our due diligence, call council if we need to, ask questions to you guys, rather than dealing with it when you've got the slab in the ground, you've got the frame up, and then we're having to stop work. Yeah.
Let's add, so in terms of maintenance, change the plan. What's doing like why 2 weeks,
3 months. The 3 months, we're seeing that houses are being constructed within 3 months. So anything within 3 months, so if it's vacant as of 3 months ago, we pretty much say there's no way that they're going to have an occupancy go. But yeah, once it starts getting to like frame stage, that time kind of shifts. And we kind of just, we make sure with council that they haven't received it.
So looking at the battle axe ones, can you go over that miracle essential for a couple of sort of, it's not really a battle axe block. The next door, so our lot, standard lot, next door neighbour on our left-hand side was a battle axe block. And there is a shared driveway, it's not a street, it's a shared driveway.
So it's common property.
Common property, so it looks like they're a corner block. And our sales can't have one, 2 meters, something up to 2 meters side setback. They've actually run for maybe like 4 weeks.
Yeah, so that scenario, I'm not too sure if you guys were across the scenario with obviously the block we had. I think it was the left-hand side, was a common property driveway leading to a block at the back. Common property, we don't treat as an adjoining allotment. So if you have, say, an existing house to the left, to the right, and common property to the left, you have to match next door. If you're vacant next door and there's common property but there's a house at the back, automatically 4 metre setback. You technically don't have any adjoining neighbours. So yeah, I think that was where we got a bit, we had a bit of back and forth with that one, but we determined it was common property. So technically, when you've got a driveway common property units next door, if the driveway is adjoining your property and it is common property, technically that's not an adjoining allotment. So you have no adjoining allotment next door.
Would it be like the maximum of battle axe block, 4 meters much, start of their property, 4 meters, and it'll go down to 1 meter once the property and the property side by side, but the 4 meters all the way down to the end of the block.
As in the side boundary.
Yeah, so that side boundary, so if it's only 4 meters section to the boundary, that's adjacent to the top property. And the second is the neighbour's battle axe block.
Yeah.
That's when it goes back down to 1 meter.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, yeah.
Is that at the start of the boundary or 4 meters? It's the down.
4 metres.
Yeah.
with the, is there a tolerance like height?
Sorry, which?
So if you have the garage.
Yep.
Car park, is there a tolerance for between, height? Approach inside of 5.5 garage.
No tolerance in the height.
Like if we've got like a bulkhead, something.
Yep.
Or a step. Like garage doors. Like can we approach about 1.5?
No, so your width, you can't encroach into, so that's got to be a clear width. In regards to the height, that's something we'll have to take away and have a look at. In regards to bulkheads and things like that, there's nothing in the regs that talks about heights in car parking spaces. But let me give a call to planning authority. I'll see what they say. And I'll have a look, see what correspondence we've got in regards to encroaching bulkheads and things like that. But as it stands, there's nothing in the regs about encroaching into the heights, things of that nature. It's more so just policing clear widths. So yeah, let me take that one back. I'll have a look at that.
Just on that one, so there is a height clearance for but it only applies to class 1Bs. And that's for wheelchair access. So when people putting wheelchairs on top of their car and driving into their garage, then you do have to have a head height clearance. But yeah, that would only apply to class 1Bs.
So, yeah, well,
I don't think you guys do class 1Bs. Do.
so I'll look into it. I don't think there's any sort of carryover from the 1B, which is what I wanted to check. So yeah, let me look into it. I'll give you a buzz.
I'd like to, something like. It's with the overshadowing, issue. What do you classify, how do you think section of the next property with the actual problem in space? And how do you think it come up? When you draw the line as being for recreation, but the size depth or is it?
So driveways, I can comfortably say it's not private open space. Yeah, it's a bit tricky. The rear obviously is gonna be your private open space, but something with a side setback of 1.2, we would not consider that recreational private open space. Just because there's services and access pretty much.
Because yes, I'll go back a couple of years now. We did have a property on track of one in the lot, so we had a zoning property where they have a 2 meter setback. And it was being fixed on, non-compliant road showing. But the neighbour actually went to, our client went to go to the next block. And, showed that there, that site was actually used for recreational purposes. Was being used as storage. To store what trailers and all that stuff in that space, it wasn't used as a recreational purpose.
Yeah. So in that case, it would have to be a case by case. I mean,
Yeah.
we'd have to sort of,
We can prove that it's not being used for recreational space.
yes.
If not reasonable downside, show like, storage or whatever it's not saying.
If it's the services side of the house, anything like that, that's not primarily used for private open space or recreation. Then we would have to apply discretion to it. But it is a very good argument that you can put forward there. Yeah. So we did have one for another builder, not you guys, where it was the services side of the house, but they had a little paved area, and this gentleman argued that that was where he had his morning coffee and cigarette. And we had to knock it back because that was his recreation. That was his area. So we have to apply discretion to it. We have to look into it. But if we can determine that it isn't primarily used, or is there a chance it can be used for recreation, then we have to look into that.
Questions. One that I know that's been had a lot of back and forth with, I know in the past. In regards to what do you think the front wall of the college? Is it an engaged here? Is it the main wall for the front? So in regards to getting what our setbacks need to be for, so basically our property as per the joint property.
So if you're, let's say, an engaged pier or a pier to that's supporting the porch beam, we don't deem that front wall. That's part of the porch. So that can encroach. Correct. If it's not supporting any porch structures, we deem that part of the front.
The MCPs that we get specified that we have a setback of 4 meters or a maximum of 6, and we take our setback to, let's say we've got a one of our residential sites has not one of those angle facades, where it's got like a 1,500 wide by 800 feet engagement here. And we take our setback to that one, and it's holding up, it's holding us. If for argument's sake, we added a door to that engagement here and turned it into a storage room, will that now be deemed as the front wall of the bottom? Then that's kind of what we, as a useful improvement for us. Technicalities, but
Technicalities, yes. Well, look, it's supporting part of the porch. So I would deem it an encroachment, an allowable encroachment, regardless of what the use is. If you're,
it's just, we've got one side and then you've got the developer who's assisting another fashion testing, that's part of the plan.
Yeah, well, in all fairness, the developers aren't issuing the permit.
So for some developers who they refuse to some program.
Yeah,
Factor
really?
system. It's a big for the points. We don't want the one that place here. So sometimes we try to follow both parties while trying to add a door to it.
Yeah.
Consider it part of the flow. We consider that as our problem.
So the developers won't allow the door.
The developers want to allow the encroachments. They consider it as part of the problem.
Right.
Touch.
I'd have to look into it. Yeah, I'd have to sit down and have a look at it, but for the purposes of minimum setbacks, supporting the porch, it's a part of the porch structure. It's an allowable encroachment. From our point of view, as long as it's within the tolerances, heights, things of that nature. Just sort of spitballing at the moment, I would deem it part of the porch encroachment, regardless if you guys put a door on it or not. Yeah, I mean, looking at it from the street, I think that's really all the developers care about, the aesthetics of the streetscape. From a use point of view, if it's supporting the porch, it's my own approach.
So that goes the same thing. With the joining property as well. Their front wall is the main wall, not any engaged, whatever it is. You have to make it fundamentally.
From their front wall.
Okay,
So allowable encroachments are only for your proposed dwelling. When you're factoring in the joining setbacks, it's to their front wall, not to say, oh, we've got a balcony, that doesn't encroach, it's to the front wall of the dwelling. Allowable encroachments are only for your proposed dwelling. Yes.
So just on that point, so we've got two neighbouring blocks. We can't encroach at all. Our porch has to be the average setbacks of the neighbouring blocks.
You can't encroach.
Yeah, is that right?
Sorry, I'm not.
If you've got two existing neighbours.
Yeah.
And it's to their front door. Is your porch still allowed encroachment?
Yeah, so if your average is 6 of the adjoining properties, your porch can still encroach 1.5 meters into that front setback.
But when you're measuring their setbacks, you're not saying their porch is over 3.6, so technically that's their front wall. The dimension goes to their front wall. We don't factor in allowable encroachments at all. Yeah.
scenarios where you put a small lot money at least to the means. In some, and then you has to be. Not the only boundary problem. But I feel like in the funds, and not up again for a different scenario.
Right.
We have to cut the fence off the body because that fence likes past the school.
But that
And they do be, it's, I have on other side of the chickens.
Yeah.
That's what pretty much checks, and then we have another one, but. For about, today.
Yeah, so if your adjoining lot, let's say small lot, if your adjoining lot isn't on the same plan of subdivision or is not subject to small lot housing code,
Yeah.
you have to comply with the regulations, part 5.
Yeah.
So wall heights, length of wall and boundary. Big one is length of wall and boundary. We've had that pop up a lot, because a lot of the small lot product is wall and boundary. So you've got to, even on small lot, things like factoring in overshadowing, daylight to habitable growing windows, everything like that, you've got to take into account. If next door isn't on the same plan of subdivision or isn't subject to smaller housing code. Okay? So if it is subject to smaller housing code, go for your life, comply with the note, the smaller housing code. But if it's not, then you've got to ensure you comply with part 5.
So the scenarios that I've sent you in the past in regards to when we have a building area plan which line that we close up, which does not have any mention of another encroachments, it just says must be built as per building envelope plan in the front itself. If it's not mentioned, to comply with the guidelines, so the guidelines are registered. But the guidelines mention correctness. We still have to go by the building envelope plan and have no other correctness correct. Whereas if you use the guidelines, even though the front itself and the title doesn't say must comply with guidelines.
So I always refer back to part one, where the building envelope doesn't, doesn't make mention of any allowable encroachments. I always refer back to part one in terms of the information guidance. But, yeah, there's still 3.6 meter floor spans
So if we've got to find something like mention of the level of preference, we can still have our needs specials. Or something approaching for
But what's the must have?
aspect one part. But
As long as it's like the MTP doesn't say no allowable.
yeah, no, that just said.
It's silent.
We have time that goes, cannot be built, but it says cannot be built outside the building envelope plan. And it doesn't mention all of which then it's specific.
Yeah, you've got to be careful with the wording too. Some MCPs are quite tricky with their wording, as you guys would be aware. If they make mention of the building includes all your porches, garages, everything like that. If it makes mention of the dwelling, then that's your dwelling. And if it doesn't mention any setback encroachments, then we can refer back to part 5. So you've got to be careful of the wording there. So building is everything. Dwelling is just the dwelling.
And dwelling that needs, only including garage.
When you have the scenarios where the finance mentions of must build, probably built outside the building envelope plan, but the guidelines specify the level of measurements, and it mentions must be built as per the MC media guidelines. And we then go and use whatever the guidelines allow us, even though if the guidelines were accepted, the guidelines where the guidelines have said, for 30 1 meter, however, approach 1.2. The boldest I have to look at the sign off. Is that still sufficient because it's mentioned in the NCD and place up to be cited as per alpha? Yes, given us building it like that. And it says entry must comply as per the alpha. Guidelines, yes, we're comply with it, but the guidelines have to approve and we've signed off and you must take plans. That then be accepted as like our reporting consent kind of thing that they're having to be seen as this.
So developers can override their own guideline. We just look for that wording within the guideline saying they can apply discretion to their design or to discretion to their approval. As soon as we see that, go for it.
Side note, I noticed that office space is so small. Why is that?
I don't know.
No idea. No idea.
But it's something that officers implement into their own planning scheme. So it's what we have to comply with. It's the restriction on the titles. It's the restriction on the planning schemes. It's something that is an approved envelope that they've implemented into their planning scheme, and we've got to take into account. No one else has done it. It's just off something. So yeah, we don't know why they've done it, but they have got to comply with it.
It's virtually the same as type A, like Artico, but, yeah. I don't know what the other differences are or why.
The lot size was 100 square meters, but very rare the next summer. It's type parents, type parents. When, you know, you're looking at regulations, would you still very small, or would you?
We would say, I think, as soon as, yeah, there's no mention on the title that it's registered, what we call building envelope. As soon as you're less than 300, you need to go for the planning.
We can, average wall height of, 55 length.
Yeah, that's fine. That's the correct way to do it. Yeah.
And what about the 3.2 average? Maximum.
so the 3.6 height. So the average, 3.2 average, you work by dividing the area by the length of wall. And the maximum height is just the maximum height from natural ground level. Yeah, I'm sorry, what was the actual question?
Is it 3.2 like a sign?
Yeah, 3.2 is the standard number. It's in the regulation, under regulation 80. So you can have a maximum height of 3.6 from natural ground level, and the average is 3.2.
I have to calculate the length and able to. Then what do I do?
So you've just got to be 3.2 maximum. So you can be an average of 2.9, 3 meters, 3.1. That's fine. You just can't exceed 3.2.
You need to comply with both as well. So, if you have a parapet on the boundary and it's 3.7, you don't comply, you work there. But if it's just a parapet, 3.6, and then the rest of the wall, you still achieve your 3.2 meter average.
Calculate the area of the fabric. Do you fully have to?
We don't. But yeah, we rely on the calculations that you give us, but yes, you should be calculating, that parapet height to encompass basically anything on the boundary, or part of the wall needs to be.
Well, the maximum setbacks to the wall. I know there is some places, some of those areas. If, for instance, there is a job where there is a maximum setback of 6 meters, and our block is it's a very odd shaped block where it starts off only about 10 meters wide, and then it branches out to be about 16 meters wide towards the rear. Obviously, calculating meters in the size house kind of because the empty of the block. Is there some sort of interpretation saying that we take on setback to distance or there something else or not like that?
So we'll take the distance, your maximum setback. There's no allowance. It's just a maximum setback it can be. So odd shaped blocks and things like that really aren't any argument to a non-compliance. It's more so you've got a maximum setback you need to be at, but you can use the odd shaped block as an argument for your appointment setback.
What about if the block starts at 10 meters and then about 4 meters in, it branches up to the 12.5, and the incidence to be on say any block after 12.5 is single cars average over 12.5. I will double car average.
As its width.
And we can the width of the frontage, so we can be down to between frontage with less than 12.5, plus some single car average over 12.5, it's a double car average. If, for instance, it's like one of those blocks where it starts off with 10.5 meters wide, and then by the time you do 4 meters front setback, it's stretched down to the past 5 meters, 12.5 meters in the middle.
That's the front.
That's the frontage.
So those clauses, things like that, are all just taking into account streetscape. Streetscapes, they're just factoring in the front title. It doesn't matter what's going on behind that. It's all in regards to the actual boundary dimension. Right, thank you, guys. It's been great for us to come out. It's been great to see all the faces, and I hope for everyone playing at home, it's been great.
Thanks.
Thank you.